There were places in Victorian London that tourists didn't go to, places that weren't written about in postcards, places where the night lasted longer than the day. When the city fell asleep, when the gas lamps trembled in the fog, when the windows of the rich houses went out one by one, there, behind closed doors, the night was just beginning. In the workhouses, people didn't sleep from fatigue. They didn't sleep from hunger. They didn't sleep from the silence that oppressed them more than the screams. This is the story of one night, about a cold bench, about a lamp that shines too dimly, about people who were forced to be silent, to work and to be grateful for it. And if you think you know what poverty is, these walls will tell you otherwise. A city that had two faces. London in the late 19th century was a city of contrasts, a city where, next to luxurious theaters, there were neighborhoods where people disappeared without a trace, where a warm three-course dinner was served around one corner and a piece of bread was considered a mercy around another. The Victorians believed in order, in discipline, in work as a way to salvation. And it was from this belief that workhouses were born. Officially, they existed to help the poor. In reality, they had another goal: to make poverty so unbearable that people would fear being there more than they would fear being hungry on the streets. Evening in a workhouse. As the sun sets over London, the workhouse does not change. The same walls, the same corridors, the same faces. But it is in the evening that it shows its true face. The door closes with a dull thud. It is not a sharp bang, but rather a heavy, final click. It is as if the city behind these doors ceases to exist. In the large common room, there are wooden benches. Not beds, not mattresses. Peaks. On one of them sits a man of about 35. He is thin, too thin for his age. His hands are folded in his knees, his fingers cramping from the cold. His clothes are only formally clean, threadbare. He does not speak. Few people speak here in the evening, because words waste energy, and there is little energy here. A lamp is burning behind him. The light is weak, yellowish, as if even it is afraid to stay here for long. The shadow from his body falls on the wall unnaturally long, as if to remind him, this night will be long. Around him are others, men, women, old people. Everyone sits separately. In the workhouse, closeness is not encouraged. Even a look here is a luxury. Someone coughs. Someone sighs quietly. Someone simply looks at the floor, because to look into the eyes is to see oneself. There will be no more food until morning, and everyone knows it. Dinner was at 6. Liquid porridge, a piece of bread, water. That should be enough to keep a person from dying, but it is not enough to make them feel alive. That is exactly how it is intended. That first night we just sat down on the bench. We hadn't talked about the rules yet, about punishment, about the work that starts before dawn, about the silence that will break those stronger than you. But all this is ahead, because the workhouse doesn't scare you right away. It waits. Rules that are not discussed. In a workhouse, there was no need to shout. Here, there was no need to explain. The rules were not written on the walls in large letters. They were woven into the very air of the place. You didn't learn them from a book. You learned them with your body. A division that begins at the threshold. As soon as a person crossed the threshold of a workhouse, they ceased to be someone. They were immediately divided. Men separately. Women separately. Children even more separately. A couple who had lived together for 20 years could never see each other again. A mother, to lose a child, the mother's voice. This was not considered cruelty. This was considered an educational measure. The Victorian logic was simple. If poverty is made unbearable, people will try never to come here. And so there was nothing here that could remind them of home. Silence as a form of discipline. After dinner, talking was forbidden. Not officially. Nobody gave orders. It's just that whoever spoke quickly learned that silence was safer. In the corner of the hall sat the warden. He didn't read. He didn't move. Sometimes it even seemed like he was sleeping. But if you said an unnecessary word, his eyes would open instantly. The offender could be deprived of part of the next day's food, be sent to the hardest work, be isolated, or simply be forced to stand all night. Here, they didn't punish right away. Here, they made the person understand. Clothing that erases identity. All the residents of the workhouse wore the same clothes. Rough, shapeless, gray or brown. It didn't warm. It didn't protect. It didn't have pockets. That was important, because pockets are privacy, and privacy in the workhouse was considered dangerous. There shouldn't be anything in the clothes where you could hide. A note, food, hope, even buttons were sometimes missing. Anything that could be torn off could become property, and property is a step towards self-respect. That wasn't allowed here. Food as a tool of control. Food in the workhouse was not a reward, and it wasn't a concern. It was a precisely calculated norm. The porridge was watery. Bread was stale. Water was cold. It was the bare minimum that didn't allow a person to die, but also didn't give them the strength to think about anything else except the next meal. An interesting fact that is rarely talked about. Rations in workhouses were often worse than in prisons, because a prisoner, according to the logic of the state, is already punished, and a poor person is not yet. He had to be educated. Sleep that does not restore. When the lamp in the hall was turned off, no one lay down, because there was nowhere to lie down. People sat on benches, sometimes with their heads on their chests, sometimes with their backs against the cold wall. Sleep came in fragments, short, unreal. The body did not rest, the mind did not turn off. The cold rose from the floor, as if the house itself breathed ice. And in this semi-darkness, people began to understand the most terrible thing. Here, time passes differently. One night could drag on forever. Why didn't anyone protest? Sometimes a modern person asks, why didn't they rebel? The answer is simple, because protest requires strength. And in the workhouse, everything was aimed at one thing, so that there was no strength left. Hunger, cold, silence, loneliness. It was a system that did not break bones, it broke the will. And when the will broke, the person himself began to believe that he deserved this place. That was exactly what they were striving for. The end of the night, not a relief. When the first pale shades of morning were filtering through the small windows, no one was happy. Morning meant work, hard, monotonous, meaningless. The man on the bench, the same one who had been sitting under the lamp, slowly straightens up. His hands are shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion. He doesn't yet know what he will do today. He will chip stones. He will uncoil ropes. He will haul sacks. But he already knows the main thing. A night in the workhouse is only preparation. Work as punishment. In the workhouse, work was not a way to earn money. It was not a path to a better life. It was not even useful. Work here existed for the sole purpose of punishing. A morning without choice. The day began before dawn, not with a bell, not with a song, but with a sharp sound that had no name, a mixture of the crash of metal and human indifference. People got up slowly. No one was in a hurry, because hurrying changed nothing. The overseer read out the tasks. His voice was monotonous, emotionless, as if he were announcing the weather. No one asked, "Why me?" Because the answer was always the same. Because you are here. Breaking stones. Work without results. One of the most common tasks was breaking stones. The men were given heavy hammers. In front of them was a pile of stones. The task? To break them into smaller ones. Not for construction, not for roads, not for the city. Simply break them. When the pile became smaller, it could be poured back and ordered to start again. This was important. A person should not see the result of his work, because the result gives meaning, and meaning is dangerous. Unwinding ropes. Another task was unwinding old ropes. Old sea ropes, soaked in salt, tar, and dirt, were spread out on the floor. A person would sit for hours, unwinding the fiber, thread by thread. Fingers ached, skin cracked, eyes tired from the monotony. This work was often given to women and the elderly, because it didn't require strength, it required patience. And patience, they believed, breaks faster than muscles. Why was the work harder than in a factory? The paradox of Victorian England. A person in a workhouse worked harder than a person in a factory, and yet received less. A factory worker at least created something. A worker in a workhouse? No. It was a matter of principle. One of the officials of the time wrote, "Work in a workhouse should not be attractive. It should be worse than any other." This was called less eligibility. Conditions in a workhouse should be worse than the lowest paid work in the open. Silence during work. They worked silently, not because speaking was explicitly forbidden, and because talking could seem like disobedience. Even a sideways glance could arouse suspicion. People worked side by side, but remained alone. In this silence, everyone was left with their own thoughts, and these thoughts were often worse than the work itself. Children and education through work. Children in workhouses worked on a par with adults, sometimes harder. They were given small, monotonous jobs: cleaning, sorting, carrying. It was believed that this was how they learned discipline. In reality, they learned one thing: that the world was not obliged to be fair. A child who broke down here rarely got up afterwards. Fatigue that never went away. By noon, his hands were shaking. His back ached. His head felt heavy, as if it had been filled with water. Lunch. Some more porridge. Some more bread. Not enough to recover. Enough to continue. And again, work. The day dragged on, as if it was being stretched out on purpose. Why was it all, really? The workhouse was supposed to set an example, not to those inside, but to those outside. It was a warning to the city: if you get poor, this is what awaits you. And fear worked. People endured terrible conditions in factories, in mines, on the streets, just to avoid getting here. The end of the working day. When work ended, no one was happy. Because there was another night ahead. Just as cold, just as quiet. People returned to the benches, to the lamp, to the shadows on the walls. And someone thought, maybe I deserve this. This was the system's greatest victory. Hunger as a method. In a workhouse, hunger was never an accident. It did not arise from a lack of food, and it was not the result of a mistake. Hunger here was a calculation. The science of malnutrition. The Victorian state loved numbers very much. It counted everything: expenses, hours of work, the number of spoonfuls of porridge. Rations in workhouses were determined by tables, precise, cold. Officials knew how many calories a person needed in order not to die, and they gave exactly that much, no more. It was hunger without chaos, hunger with a seal and a signature. A breakfast that does not wake up. Morning food was served quickly, as if haste could hide its meagerness. Watery porridge, water in which floated the taste of grain. Sometimes a piece of bread, thin as a promise. People ate in silence, not out of politeness, but because talking while eating forced the brain to remember what it was like to be full. And that was dangerous. What hunger does to the mind. In the early days, people thought about food constantly. They imagined smells. They remembered dishes from childhood. Then something changed. Thoughts became slower. Emotions were muffled. Words were superfluous. Hunger doesn't just take away strength. It takes away imagination. And without imagination, there is no protest. Deliberate monotony. The food never changed. Day after day, week after week, the same porridge, the same bread, the same water. Even if there was enough food, the monotony made it a punishment. Taste is pleasure, and pleasure in the workhouse was considered moral weakness. Physical consequences. People lost weight quickly, too quickly. Eyes sank, skin lost color. Hands became cold even on warm days. Some fainted while working. Some began to tremble for no reason. Some simply sat down and never got up again. But this did not cause panic, because the system also provided for this. Weak and lazy. Those who could not stand it were not considered sick. They were called lazy. A person who collapsed from exhaustion was considered to be guilty of his own condition. If I wanted to, I would work. Thus, hunger was transformed into proof of moral guilt. An interesting fact that is rarely talked about. Some doctors of the time noted that people in workhouses often ate more slowly than in prisons, not because of upbringing, but because every mouthful was important. Food ceased to be food. It became an event. Hunger and silence. Over time, people stopped complaining, not because hunger disappeared, but because the brain saved energy. Even pain became muffled. Hunger is not a scream. Hunger is silence. Evening after a hungry day. After work, dinner was the same as breakfast. The body did not recover. It simply did not have time to die. People returned to the benches. Someone put their hand on their stomach. Someone looked at the floor. And in this silence, a thought arose that was more terrible than hunger itself. Maybe this is my life. Why the system worked? Because it did not break people abruptly. It erased them gradually, step by step, spoon by spoon, day by day. And when a person could no longer imagine another life, he stopped looking for it. Silent transition to night. When the lamp was lit again, and the shadows fell on the walls again, people were too tired to think. Hunger had done its job. But there was another test ahead, which affected not the body, but the soul. Silence and loneliness. In a workhouse, silence was never a void. It was a presence. It sat among people. It stood in the corridors. It weighed on the shoulders heavier than fatigue. Here, silence was not the absence of sound. It was part of the punishment. Silence as a rule, not a request. In many workhouses, there was an unspoken rule. Speaking without permission was undesirable. Formally, it was called maintaining order. In reality, it was a way of isolation. A person who does not speak ceases to be dangerous, because dangerous people are those who share their thoughts, who compare, who notice injustice. Silence took away people's opportunity to see that they are not alone. When there are people nearby, but no intimacy. The halls of the workhouse were full, and at the same time empty. Dozens of people sat nearby, but did not touch each other. They did not look into each other's eyes. They did not know each other's names. The system did not simply divide men and women. It divided people among themselves, because a lonely person obeys more easily. The night hours are the hardest. During the day, work was a distraction. Even hunger gave way to movement. But at night, when the body stopped, everything else returned. Thoughts, memories, fear. People remembered the homes that they no longer had, the jobs they had lost, relatives they did not know if they would see again, and there was no one to share it with. The man on the bench. The same man that we saw the first night is sitting under the lamp. He tries not to look at others, not because he doesn't want to, but because he's afraid of seeing himself. He thinks about little things, about warm tea, about the sound of footsteps in the house, about the voice that once called his name. These memories hurt more than hunger. Loneliness as a form of re-education. The Victorians believed that poverty is a consequence of moral weakness, and moral weakness, in their opinion, can be corrected by silence and reflection. Loneliness here was presented as a chance to rethink life. In fact, it broke down internal resistance. A person who is silent for a long time begins to doubt his own thoughts. The danger of the inner voice. When there are no external voices, only the inner voice remains. And this voice is not always good. It begins to repeat what a person has heard from supervisors, officials, newspapers. It's your own fault. You didn't try hard enough. You're here because you deserve it. Thus, the system began to speak through the person himself. Why friendship was undesirable. Sometimes, two people tried to break the silence, to exchange a word, with a look, with a tiny gesture. The system did not encourage this, because friendship is power, and power here was undesirable. Even sitting next to each other could be changed by ordering them to move seats. They did not punish immediately. They simply separated. Silence and time. In silence, time behaved strangely. Minutes dragged on. Hours blurred. Days lost their boundaries. People stopped counting how much time they had here. This was also part of the method, because a person who doesn't know when it will end stops waiting. Small acts of resistance. And yet, sometimes the silence cracked. Someone left a piece of bread for someone else. Someone looked into each other's eyes longer than allowed. Someone nodded softly, as if to say, "I see you." These little things were almost imperceptible, but they meant one thing: not everyone broke. The night passes, but loneliness remains. When the lamp dimmed and the morning began to gray outside the window, no one felt any relief. Because day meant work, and night meant silence. And loneliness passed from darkness to light, together with people. In the next chapter, we will see what illness, weakness, and old age looked like inside the workhouse. Weak and useless. In the workhouse, a person was valued exactly as long as he could work, no more and no less. When strength disappeared, and with it, value disappeared. A line that everyone was afraid to cross. Every resident of the workhouse had an invisible line. It was not marked with chalk. It was not spoken about out loud, but everyone knew it. It was the moment when the hands would no longer obey, when the back would not allow you to get up, when breathing became too heavy for another day of work. To cross this line meant one thing: you become a burden. Old age in a place where there is no mercy. The old people in the workhouse were especially quiet. They did not complain. They did not ask. They did not wait. Victorian society believed that a person who lived to an old age in poverty simply didn't cope with life. And the workhouse was, as if, the final result of this failure. The old worked as long as they could stand, and when they couldn't anymore, they were simply pushed aside. Sickness as personal guilt. It was dangerous to get sick in a workhouse, not because there was no medicine, but because illness was seen as a weakness of character. A person with a cough, with a fever, with a pain in the chest. She wasn't asked what was wrong. She was told to work more slowly. And if she fell, she was considered lazy. The doctor who didn't come to treat. Many workhouses had a doctor, but his role was limited. He did not come to restore a person to health. His task was to determine whether the person could still work. If so, he was sent back. If not, he was put in isolation. Rooms for the unfit. Those who could no longer work were moved to separate rooms. They were colder, darker, quieter. There was no work here, but there was no hope either. People lay or sat, staring at the wall, waiting for something unknown. This was not called death. This was called waiting. Children who quickly became weak. Children in the workhouse broke down more quickly. Their bodies could not stand the hunger. Their bones could not stand the work. Their lungs could not stand the cold. A child who got sick ceased to be promising, and they were transferred to the same place where the old ones ended up. It was a quiet place, almost motionless, almost soundless. Why the system wasn't afraid of death. A death in the workhouse wasn't an event. It was a statistic, an entry in a journal, a tick in a report, a line in a spreadsheet. The system was big enough to afford losses. The man under the lamp disappears. Remember the man who sat on the bench the first night? His movements became slower. His breathing became heavier. One morning he wasn't woken up for work, not because they felt sorry for him, but because he was no longer useful. He disappeared from the hall as quietly as he had once disappeared from the city. The most terrible thing is not pain. People were afraid not of pain, not of hunger, not of cold. They were afraid of becoming unnecessary. Because in the workhouse, it meant one thing. You are no longer a part of even this cruel system. You are outside of it. The silence that becomes final. In the rooms for the unabled, the silence was different. It did not press. It did not wait. It simply was. And in this silence, people slowly disappeared, without protest, without witnesses, without stories. Why were they not talked about? Because the workhouse was supposed to remain an example, and an example should not evoke sympathy. It should evoke fear, and fear worked. In the next chapter, we will talk about those who tried to escape. Escape attempt. The doors of the workhouse were not always locked, and that was the greatest cruelty. In theory, you could leave. In practice, almost no one did. The myth of free exit, Victorian officials like to repeat, no one is keeping you here by force. And it was true, at least on paper. But behind the doors of the workhouse, a city awaited that was even colder, even more indifferent, and even more dangerous. Anyone who left without work, without money, without strength, risked never returning. Fear outside is greater than fear inside. A person who had been in the workhouse for a long time began to fear freedom. On the street, decisions had to be made. To look for food, finding shelter, talking to people. In the workhouse, decisions were made for you. Food was meager but guaranteed. Nights were cold but predictable. This predictability kept people inside. Those who dared. And yet, sometimes, someone dared. Usually they were new. Those who still remembered the taste of freedom, who were not yet accustomed to the rhythm of this place. They left early in the morning, or at dusk, silently, without goodbyes. Not because there was no one to say goodbye to, but because goodbyes are weakness. Return. Many of them returned. A day later, a week later, a month later. Returning was the most terrifying moment, because now the system had proof. You tried and failed. Such a person was not expected to be beaten, and not to be shouted at. He was expected to be coldly precise. Punishment without violence. Those who returned after escaping were rarely beaten. It was unnecessary. They were given the hardest work, the worst food, the deepest silence, sometimes isolation, not as a punishment, but as an educational measure. The system wanted the others to see this. The effect of example. The escape of one person became a lesson for all, not because of the cruelty of the punishment, but because of its inevitability. After that, the prison was even more silent for weeks. People looked at the floor and thought the same thing. It's better here than nowhere. An escape that is not visible. There were other escapes. Not physical. Some stopped talking. Some stopped looking. Some stopped thinking about the future. It was an escape into oneself. The system did not notice it, and even encouraged it. The man who would not leave. The man who had once sat under the lamp could have left. The door was open. No one was standing guard. But he stayed, not out of fear of punishment, but out of fear of emptiness. Because behind the door there was nothing except fog and hunger. Why the workhouse was a trap. Because it offered a minimum of survival in exchange for complete obedience. And for many, it seemed like a deal. A bad one, humiliating, but by agreement. The end of the illusion of choice. After several escape attempts, people stopped talking about getting out, even in their minds. The doors remained open, but ceased to exist. In the next chapter, we will see how the outside world viewed the workhouses and why most of the townspeople considered them necessary. Eyes of the city. London lived next to workhouses, and at the same time, as if it did not notice them. They stood among residential areas, near roads, sometimes right next to markets and churches. But for most townspeople, they were empty buildings, without stories, without faces. Fear as the basis of compassion. The Victorians sympathized with the poor, but from a distance. Compassion should not be too close, because closeness gives rise to questions, and questions are uncomfortable. The workhouse allowed one to feel morally pure. They are not abandoned to their fate. They were taken care of, even if this care was life-breaking. Newspapers and the correct history. Newspapers of that time rarely wrote about the inner world of workhouses. When they wrote, it was in the language of order and discipline. The lazy are corrected by work. Poverty is controlled. Public funds are spent wisely. It was a convenient story, and the city readily believed it. Poverty as a moral vice. One of the most dangerous ideas of the era was the belief that poverty was a choice, that a person was poor because he was lazy, because he was intemperate, because he was wrong. The workhouse became not just an institution, but a moral court. The church and the silent consent. Churches often supported the existence of workhouses, not always openly, but systematically. They talked about humility, about work as the path to salvation, about trials sent from above. These words sounded beautiful, especially from the pulpit. Less beautiful on a cold bench under a lamp. The class that did not want to look. The middle class of London had one fear, of finding themselves on the other side of the door. The workhouse was a reminder. Work, try, don't make mistakes. This fear made the system acceptable. For if the workhouse was terrible, all the more so, one must do everything to avoid it. The workhouse as a warning. Its existence was a signal, not for the poor, but for those who were still holding on. Look what happens. And the signal worked. Those who saw the truth. There were also those who knew more. Social reformers, some doctors, some writers. They wrote reports. They sent letters. They talked about cruelty. But their voices were lost in the noise of the big city. Charles Dickens and the image of fear. Dickens described workhouses as places that were cold and inhuman, but even his texts were often read as fiction, because the truth is easier to accept when it seems exaggerated. The city passes. People walked past the high walls without looking at the windows, because to look was to see, and to see was to respond. Why was this possible? Because the workhouse did not exist in a vacuum. It was part of the city, part of morality, part of fear. And as long as the majority considered it a necessary evil, it remained what it was. Silence behind the walls. And behind the walls, in the same hall, people sat on benches, not knowing that the city considers them an example. Cracks in the system. No system collapses with a bang. It begins to crack quietly. Sometimes with a single question. Sometimes with a single letter. Sometimes with a single glance that lingers too long. The first doubts. At the end of the 19th century, a new word appears in London: investigation. Not revolution, not rebellion, but something much more dangerous for the authorities: a fact-checking. Social reformers begin to visit workhouses officially, with permits, with notebooks, with questions. And suddenly, what for years has been called order begins to look like methodical exhaustion. Reports that no one wanted to read. The reports turn up numbers: number of deaths, average age of residents, length of stay. The numbers were dry, but they were the ones who scared the most, because they couldn't be put down to exaggeration or emotion. Testimony from the inside. Some former residents started to speak, carefully, without loud words. They described sleepless nights, work without meaning, hunger without limits. Their stories were similar, too similar to be fiction. The system's reaction. The system didn't respond immediately. It pretended that nothing was happening, because admitting a problem meant admitting responsibility, and responsibility was scary. Small changes, big fears. Some workhouses suddenly improved conditions: a little more food, a little cleaner premises, a little less punishment. Not out of mercy, but out of caution, because the cracks were already visible. Newspapers are starting to ask. A few journalists dare to write differently, not as about idlers, but as about people. These articles were not popular, but they existed, and that was enough to make the system anxious. Fear of losing control. The workhouse was kept quiet, in ignorance, in the distance between the city and those who were inside. When this distance was reduced, a threat appeared. Officials and defensive formulations. In official responses, the words individual cases, misunderstanding, necessary measures. These words did not deny the facts, they blurred them. The man who is no more. No one wrote about the man who once sat under the lamp in reports. He was just a number, a unit in statistics. But it was precisely such units that truth was made up of. Doubt as the beginning of the end. The system still stood. The walls were still strong. The rules were still in effect. But now it had something that it had not had before: doubt. And doubt is the most dangerous thing for any cruelty. The silence changes. The workhouses didn't know about it yet. People, as before, sat on benches. They ate porridge. They were silent. But somewhere behind these walls, someone already saw things differently. In the next section, we will see how reforms began to trickle in, and why they were slow, painful, and often belated. When the rules began to change. Change never enters such places abruptly. They don't kick down doors. They don't break down walls. They seep in slowly, like cold through stone. Reforms without triumph. When the first reforms were adopted, they weren't announced loudly. There were no holidays. There were no solemn speeches. There were circulars, new instructions, streamlined wording. The workhouses were supposed to become less strict, less but not more humane. What actually changed? Somewhere the rations were increased a little. Somewhere, more blankets were allowed. Somewhere, working hours were shortened. It looked like progress, on paper, but the essence remained the same. Poverty was still considered a crime. Resistance from within the system. The greatest resistance to reforms came not from the residents, but from the administration. The wardens feared losing control. The officials were the authority. The local government was the example for others. Every change was perceived as a threat to order. Old habits outlast rules. Even when the rules changed, behavior did not. People remained silent. They remained afraid. They continued to sit on the benches even when an alternative appeared. The system taught them this too well. Human stories that did not make it. The reforms did not bring back those who had already disappeared. The man under the lamp did not see the changes. The old people who were transferred to cold rooms did not hear the new rules. Children who broke early did not get a second chance. Improvement as a compromise. The changes were not the result of compassion. They were the result of pressure. Newspapers, reports, public anxiety. And so they were cautious, minimal, calculated. Was life any easier? For some, yes. For many, hardly any. The workhouse was still a place of fear. It was just a bit quieter now. A new generation and old memory. Those who came later had heard the legends of cold nights, of hungry days, of punishment without shouting. And even if some of it was no longer true, the fear remained. Changes without apologies. No one apologized, not to the living, not to the dead. The system simply moved on, as if nothing had happened. The city looks away again. London was quickly getting used to the new reality. Now it was possible to say, "We have done something," and that was enough to stop looking inward. Silence after the reforms. The workhouses became a little quieter, not because of peace, but because of fatigue. People learned not to wait for radical change. When a person left the workhouse, it did not mean that the workhouse left them. They followed, quietly, unnoticeably, like a shadow longer than the day. Life after. Some did indeed leave. They found temporary work. They rented a corner in a cold room. They returned to the city they remembered. But the city already looked differently. Anyone who had been to the workhouse, as if they were wearing an invisible mark. People did not ask directly, but they knew. Shame that is heavier than hunger. The hardest thing was not physical exhaustion, but shame. Shame that you couldn't cope, that you had to ask for help, that you were seen there. This shame was not washed away by work. It did not disappear with time. It became part of the voice inside, a broken sense of home. For many, the concept of home changed forever after the workhouse. Doors were no longer associated with safety, rules with order, silence with peace. Even in a warm room, some would wake up at night, waiting for the light of the lamp and the cold bench. Those who did not speak. Most did not tell, not because they did not want to, but because they could not find the words. How to explain the silence that oppresses, hunger that does not scream, work that has no meaning? Simple words did not work. Memory transmission. The children of those who went through the workhouse heard fragments, not whole stories. Phrases, looks, a pause before answering. You don't want to go there. Work while you can. Keep quiet and bear it. Thus, the memory was passed on, not as a story, but as a warning. Why they didn't like to remember it. The workhouses were an inconvenient past. They didn't fit into the history of progress, into the belief in morality, into the pride of empire. It was easier to forget than to admit. Traces in character. People who went through it often remained reserved. They didn't complain. They didn't ask. They didn't expect help. Because they learned, help has a price. Small victories. And yet there were those who managed to live on, who started families, who worked, who silently helped others without asking why. They didn't call it heroism. They just didn't want anyone else to end up there. The workhouse as a shadow of the city. Even when the buildings were demolished, the place remained heavy. People said, "Something is wrong here. It's colder here. You don't want to stay here," as if the stones remembered. The man under the lamp is not alone. We don't know his name. We don't know what he really looked like. But we do know that there were thousands like him, and that's the main truth. Before the finale. This story is not about one person, and not about one night. It's about a system that knew how to make pain invisible, and about a memory that refused to disappear. A night that remembers. A night in a Victorian workhouse was never just a night. It was a refuge. For weariness, for silence, for things that had nowhere to go during the day. As the lamps dimmed and the steps of the wardens grew rarer, the building seemed to sigh, as if even the stone allowed itself a moment of weariness. Silence, after all. On this last night, there are no shouts, no orders, no hurry. People sit or lie, each in his own corner, and the silence between them no longer seems so hostile. She has become an acquaintance, not a friend, but a companion. The city sleeps, but memory does not. London sleeps behind the walls. No carriages drive. The shops are closed. The gas lamps flicker in the fog. The city can afford to sleep. But here, within these walls, memory never sleeps. It walks the corridors, sits on benches, stops where people once sat, whose names no one has written down. Invisible presences. If you sit in silence for a long time, it can seem that you are not alone, not out of fear, but out of a feeling, as if someone once sat here just like that, staring at the floor, waiting for morning, and thinking the same thoughts. These are not ghosts. These are traces. Why these places are difficult even now. Even today, when most of the workhouses have disappeared, people feel something strange passing by their former places. They say, "It's colder there. It's quieter there. You don't want to stay there." It's as if the earth remembers too much silence. What's left of the system? The system is gone. The rules have changed. The buildings have been rebuilt or demolished. But there are things that are not so easy to erase. Fear of poverty, shame for needing help, silence about what happened. These things have survived the stone. A lesson not written in textbooks. The workhouses taught society one thing: cruelty can be silent. It can look like order, like discipline, like care with conditions. And that's why it's dangerous. The man under the lamp. Again. Let's go back once more to the man who was sitting on the bench under the lamp. We don't know how his story ended, but perhaps that is the point, because he was not an exception. He was a part, and there were thousands of such stories. Why it is important to remember. Not to blame the past, but to recognize familiar mechanisms in the present. When helping becomes punishment. When silence is considered a virtue. When a person is evaluated only by his benefit. Silence as a witness. This story ends the same way it began, in silence. But now this silence is different. It does not erase. It preserves. Before leaving, if you listened to this story to the end, then someone else heard these voices. Not loud, not demanding, but real. And perhaps, by leaving a few words here, you will help this silence to speak again. A gentle farewell whisper. If these slow stories help you to stop, to think, or to fall asleep, you can stay here. Subscribe. Write a short comment, even one word. It's a small gesture, but it's gestures like these that make memories. The end of the night. The lamp goes out. The shadows disappear. The night recedes. But the story remains. Quiet, slow, alive. Thank you for being here. And until the next quiet night.